Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And if you follow the news, you know that gun control, concealed carry, and gun violence are very much in the news today. So tonight, our guest is a member of the faculty at Oakton Community College with an extensive background in criminal justice and gun violence, gun control. Mr. Chester Kulis is our guest. Chester, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's start with some basics about gun control and what the issues are and how the different perspectives vary. I know you have mentioned that there are several different perspectives, the medical community, the law enforcement community, the NRA. So explain, if you would, a little bit about what those different perspectives are and who the people are who hold them.
Well, Illinois has always been in the middle of the road on the issue of gun regulation. We haven't gone too far to the left, too far to the right. We have what I would call the law enforcement perspective. And whether we had a Republican governor, Democratic governor, we've had so many governors in the last 40, 50 years, they've all basically taken a supportive attitude toward reasonable gun control. And what that basically said was, we have a FOID card system, firearm identification. You have to have a license to have ammunition and to possess a gun.
And that's law today.
That's the law today. And we also regulate where you can keep guns. And basically, under Illinois law, we basically said you can only have a gun on your land, at your house, residence, or at your business. We've also regulated when you can use deadly force, specifically when someone threatens you with deadly force or a forcible felony.
And that's as opposed to, say, Florida, where the stand your ground kinds of laws exist. And that's not true here in Illinois, correct?
Right. And we've had these laws, the bulk of them, since the 1960s. And like I say, Republicans, Democrats, I can give the list of all the governors, and they've all supported. There's been no effort to retract those laws.
So when you described it, though, as being essentially the law enforcement perspective, can you describe that when you say it's kind of middle of the road? Well, what does it mean? It means it's not too extreme in one way or the other, but how does that show itself? Well,
I can mention there are two other perspectives that stand in contrast. The more recent development would be what I call the medical perspective. And whereas the Illinois traditional law enforcement is a balance between preventing but also punishing and catching offenders, the medical perspective would emphasize very much prevention and the mental health dimension. And it would also say that the critical issue is the large number of guns that are easily available. And because of that, the lethality is increased.
So it's seen as a public health issue?
Public health issue.
And gun violence being a major cause of death, especially in certain demographics, right, certain age groups.
And it would emphasize, for example, the issue that unlike most people's perception, the vast majority of gun deaths in the United States are suicides, which by definition have a mental health issue involved. And homicide, a lot of it is interpersonal conflict, emotional issues, family, whatever, arguments, and accidents. And so I think what the medical perspective says is we can't eliminate violence, but we can decrease the lethality of it by trying to reduce the easy availability of so many guns. The third perspective is the one that we are seeing in Congress at work today, and that is basically the NRA. And the NRA, if you were to summarize their position, and I don't think they would take offense at my summary, is they've never seen a gun that they didn't like or a gun control that they thought anything about. And again, they've held sway in Congress for a lot of reasons. But I think people are questioning that. And what I like to emphasize too, in Illinois, we've had this moderate position. If you look, for example, at our two senators, Kirk, who's a Republican, and Durbin, both of them are strongly supportive of reasonable gun control. Both of them have gotten bad grades from the NRA. Our governors, as I said, have supported gun control. We recently had an election to replace Congressman Jesse Jackson.
Right.
And everybody was betting, Congresswoman Halverson is going to win. She happened to be the only Caucasian.
She was the front runner at the time.
And front runner in the polls. And basically, Robin Kelly made an issue of gun violence. And guess who won? In a crowded slate.
Going away.
She won going away. So I think the issue comes up that when people actually start to vote on that issue, and it becomes an issue in the campaign, we see where, in fact, people do vote against the NRA. There was one kind of...
Well, let's stop there for a second, because I think that's an important statement, and most elected leaders would tell you, or they may not say it, but there seems to be a palpable fear that the NRA is so well-funded and so strong and so politically powerful that if you oppose them as an elected official, you're going to be beaten. And so there is this kind of built-in almost apathy that, well, you can't fight them, so don't even bother. What was different? What happened here in the case of Robin Kelly?
Well, Newtown specifically, and all these horrific shootings. And I think what we've seen, let me tell you, a number of years ago, a guy by the name of Glenn Pritchard ran for governor, Democrat.
Yes.
He actually had a liberal reputation on most issues. He was supported by unions, strong union guy, coming from the Southern Illinois, good guy. The one problem with him is coming from Southern Illinois, he took basically an NRA position. Well, he did not win in Chicago, and most importantly, he didn't win in the suburbs among women voters. Well, guess what? Glenn Pritchard did not get the nomination.
Because he was in favor of it, because he had the NRA position.
Right.
So there's another case from, and that was how many years ago? 12?
Oh, that was
15,
20 years ago at this
Yeah.
point. So again, we see, particularly in Illinois, Illinois is a moderate state. And I think what's going to happen, there's probably nationally, there's about 15% of the voters who are NRA, strong, fanatic NRA voters. And politicians, being politicians, know that if they vote against the NRA, they're going to lose that 15%. Until now, the 80 or 90% who supported gun control at some level did not vote that issue. They voted other issues. They voted the economy. They voted, whatever they wanted to vote. But now, after what happened at Newtown and what happened in Colorado, shooting at the theater, people are starting to vote that issue. Let me give you an example. When Obama ran 2008 in the presidential Democratic primary, Pennsylvania, that issue came up. It was the first anniversary of the horrific shooting at Virginia Tech. And then-candidate Obama said he was asked about the Washington gun ordinance ban, and he said he wasn't familiar enough to comment.
So he had to dodge the question.
Dodged it.
Right.
The following election, 2012, well, we just had the shooting in Colorado a few months before. Obama said he favored the assault weapon ban. Romney flip-flopped. He basically said he supported it when he was in liberal Massachusetts, but now that he's running for president, he no longer supported it, no longer thought it was a good idea. Guess who won? So, I think there are changes coming. Now, it's going to take a long time, but there are changes coming.
So let's talk a little bit about Illinois. And speaking of changes coming, the recent court ruling that said that Illinois must pass some sort of concealed carry law. So how does that change the dynamic?
We're not sure. If I knew exactly how that was going to turn out, I'd probably go into the stock market because I think at this point we don't know. From what everybody says, the legislature is tied in knots. The only thing they're equally tied with is the pension reform. But gun control, nobody knows what's going to happen. But I can tell you this, the U.S. Supreme Court recently was asked to review the New York state law, which Court of Appeals upheld. And as you know, New York has one of the toughest gun control laws.
In the wake of Newtown.
And guess what? The U.S. Supreme Court declined to accept the case for review. So that the New York law stands. Now, whether or not the judges in the Supreme Court took account of Newtown, I don't know. But they certainly said, even in the original cases, which caused all these problems, that basically there is reasonable room for gun control. Now, what's reasonable? Nobody says.
And that's the main problem that's going to exist here in Illinois, right, is they try to craft something that will be acceptable to the public at large. So what is it about concealed carry? In fact, I was surprised myself to find out that Illinois was the last remaining state that did not have a concealed carry law. Actually, I just found that shocking. What is it about concealed carry that's so politically powerful that it gets passed in 49 states?
Well, it's an emotional issue, okay? Last figures I saw just last week, about 4% of the adults in Wisconsin have a carry concealed permit. Now, let me be cautious about that. A couple things. First, it doesn't mean necessarily that all those people are packing concealed guns. A lot of them, it's like getting a driver's license. You get a driver's license without having a car. Secondly, that doesn't mean that they're carrying their guns all the time. One of the problems with carrying a concealed weapon is you probably don't have the gun when you need it. I remember debating once a prominent spokesman on behalf of carry a concealed weapon. And I worked in law enforcement my whole career. And I went behind my coat and pulled out my make-believe gun. I said, give me your gun, and while I'm at it, my friends are taking your guns at the house. And he said, that's not fair. That's tricky. And I said to him, hey, you know, criminals aren't going to tell you to get your gun out. They're going to have the element of surprise.
Sure.
So what we see here, you know, one of the things that people should be aware of is the law has some impact. It's very important. But the major issue is the availability of guns. Let me give you an example. If I took my magic wand and I waved it to the left, and I did away with every gun control law we had, the NRA position, and I waved it to the right, and I enacted every conceivable gun control law that the other side wants, either way, we still got 300 million guns.
In the United States.
We got to deal with those guns. Now, Canada, we discussed, basically they have a fraction of the guns that we have. They have a fraction of the gun violence. You know, they compare Toronto versus Chicago. Toronto had like 60 homicides.
Now, those two cities are about the same size.
About 3 million
people.
3 million. Now, Canada has 34 million. They had 179 homicides with guns.
In the country.
In the whole country. So something is going on here between us and Canada. And I remember talking once to the Minister of Justice in Canada a number of years ago. And he said he cannot believe, and Canadians cannot believe, that we fret so much about what we call the Second Amendment. He said, we don't have a Second Amendment in Canada. We have a lot of guns for hunting, but we don't have the gun violence you do. And you know, you guys, whenever there was gun violence, it's always, well, guess what America's up to?
Well, now, in the U.S., I've read recently that gun ownership is in fact dropping, that fewer people own guns, but the people who do own them own more of them.
Correct.
And as I also read, that the level of lethality of the guns being sold continues to increase.
Exactly.
Because like any product manufacturer, that newer, better, faster, stronger, and so the gun manufacturers make these guns that are far more powerful or have bigger clips, or however you divide it up, the bottom line is that they are more lethal than they have been in the past.
Exactly.
And so there are more of those out. So for the people who feel that they need to own more guns, versus the people who seem to be a growing majority who feel that guns pose a problem, is there an easy balance to strike between those two positions and allow the people who want to have a large collection of highly lethal weapons? Should we think about preventing that, or do we say, well, that's okay?
Well, I think there's going to be reasonable compromise. You know, I've been in law enforcement for 35 years before I retired, and I got involved because my brother was killed in a homicide in 1972.
A gun homicide.
Gun homicide. And around 1990, I was president of the Illinois Academy of Criminology, and I organized at the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office a seminar for law enforcement. And they pointed out at that time a disturbing trend that they've seen, incidents where a number of people were getting shot in one incident, or a victim was getting shot many times. And that was new, because before that, the gun of choice was a revolver. And all of a sudden, we were starting to see semi-automatics and then assault weapons. A friend of mine, Mike Robbins, a Chicago police officer, served a tour of duty in Vietnam, came back to Chicago and got shot 11 times with an assault weapon.
Here in Chicago.
Exactly. And eventually he died prematurely and his badge is retired. I can remember not far from here meeting with Congressman Hyde when he considered the original assault weapon ban. And I asked him, Congressman, are you going to support that ban? He said, of course I will. And there was a time when Republicans supported gun control. There was a time when the NRA supported the 1968 Gun Control Act and even background checks. And we've seen them taken over by the radicals, the Tea Party types, who don't want to compromise, who see any attempt to regulate guns as selling out. And you know, I think the voters are going to have to decide what side of the issue they're going to go on this.
So, well, yes, it does ultimately come back to the voters. Should they be thinking about regulations of gun manufacturers as well? So I know that the assault weapons ban is one effort to try to approach that. You can't, under various versions of it, you wouldn't be able to either manufacture or sell or own high-capacity magazines, for example, or rapid-fire weapons. Is it pressure to be brought on the manufacturers, or is it pressure that you bring on elected officials, or is it both? Or what's the correct strategy if the goal is to reduce the number and lethality of guns?
It's a multifaceted thing. Give you an example. As a victim, I was really disappointed and upset when I read after Newtown that not only did the gun industry not suspend sales of assault weapons, at least for a month or two, but they actually had a bumper crop. They were selling them off the shelf like crazy. I mean, a national
People were
tragedy.
afraid they were going to be restricted, and so they were buying them.
But they've done this every time. Every time there's a crisis, when Obama got elected, they did the same thing, both elections. They always manufacture a crisis to sell more guns, okay? And one of the things that you got to realize is guns don't die. Handguns that were invented 50 years ago are still operable.
Yeah, still very lethal.
So what they have to do, if they're going to continue selling, they have to start selling to new audiences, younger people, women, generate concerns, phobias, if you will. And they also deal with selling more expensive guns, assault weapons. We see probably something like 200,000 assault weapons in the United States. We have to decide, is this the kind of weapon we want on our streets to be used against our police?
So let's use that to segue a little bit. I know you brought some exhibits here. You've got a calendar here of pictures drawn by children who were affected by gun violence. And I think when we think about guns and the lethality of them on the street, we don't often think of the victims, or at least not often enough, outside of national tragedies like Newtown. So talk about this a little bit.
Well, this is published by the Illinois Council Against Handgun Violence, and we've been doing this for about 10 years. One of the things, again, you got to keep in mind is children, this is part of their world. When I ask even my students at Oakton, how many of you know someone who was shot with a gun who committed suicide? A fourth of the hands go up. This is part of their new reality. And I guess the bottom line is, children don't want this world. They don't want, AK-47s in schools. They don't want armed teachers. They don't want SWAT teams. I remember when I was a kid, the old nuns used to tell us to get under the desk because of missiles coming over from Russia.
Nuclear attack, right.
Now we're talking about SWAT teams in our schools? This is crazy.
Well,
and we got to do something about this.
The school in my neighborhood, the school on whose board I sit, had a lockdown drill today. It was just a drill, but it was how to lock down the school in case of a shooter in the school. And this, you're right, this has now become part of the regular practice of schools, how to deal with a shooter with very lethal weapons coming in.
But we spend so much time talking about court decisions and politics. We also got to deal with recognition that most movements, social movements, start at the grassroots. Politicians don't want to get involved with controversy. Courts don't want to get involved. I think what we have to do is start at the grassroots. Our churches, seeing this as an ethical issue. This is ethical. Is it an armed society really a polite society? Is it a Christian society or a Muslim society? Everybody having a gun and shooting it out as soon as you see someone look suspicious? Churches have got to speak out. I saw recently a church bulletin that recommended writing to your congressman demanding tougher gun control. PTAs, school boards, write to your congressman. One thing I'd like to say too, people say, well, how can I have an impact? There are a lot of folks in this audience listening tonight who have guns in their home, who don't particularly want them. They maybe inherited it from Uncle Joe or whatever, and they don't want it, they don't know what to do with it. Call your police department up. Get them to come over, take the gun, and for heaven's sake, if you do have a gun, keep it trigger locked, unloaded, take some common sense. When I've worked in criminal justice, I also worked with victims. And the one common denominator is they first never thought it would happen to them. And what did happen, they said, for heaven's sake, please do something about it so someone else's family doesn't have that tragedy.
There was a very poignant story on National Public Radio, a series just recently, where the reporters went into Chicago schools down, I believe it was the Englewood neighborhood, and talked to the children about how, why they did the kinds of things they did, why they exhibited this behavior. And the one that struck me most was that when the kids, and these are high school kids, when they left school, they wouldn't walk down the sidewalks. They'd crowd into the middle of the street and stop traffic. And the reporters initially thought, well, this is just kids being obnoxious, and this is just being teenagers doing it because they can get away with it. But when they talked to them, they asked why they did it, and the answer was, because if you're in the middle of the street, you have more time to see who has a gun on either side, and you have more options for ducking to get out of the way.
Yeah.
So this was a conscious behavioral decision on their part to walk down the middle of the street because it was much safer. And when asked about how many knew someone who had been a victim of gun violence, they all raised their hands.
Exactly.
So in some neighborhoods, it's not 25%, it's 100%.
Well, you know, one of the things I brought down, I don't know if your viewers can see it, is this book that was published in 2002, a year after the 9/11 tragedy. And basically, it was a resurgence book. It talked about how kids born on 9/11, this is the hope of the future.
Right.
Well, one of the kids who was born on 9/11 was little Christina Taylor, who, last name was Green, was one of the girls who was killed when Congressman Giffords got shot, the 11-year-old child. She went to see how a congressman worked.
So here was someone who was a survivor, well, a symbol of rebirth from 9/11.
Right.
And she herself was killed, gun violence, random gun violence.
At meeting a congresswoman.
She was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
And she went to see how Congress worked, and unfortunately, we saw how Congress worked in the last month.
Or didn't.
It didn't work. And very honestly, you know, we tend to emphasize violence in the cities, and it certainly hits minorities. Gun violence is the leading cause of death among African American males for many years. But it occurs every place. You know, Tucson occurred in northern Illinois, one of our early press conferences at Oakton.
Was an upscale high school.
You know, and just recently, about 2 weeks ago, there was a shooting where 5 people got killed near Springfield, domestic kind of situation. It was on page 11 of the Tribune. We don't read about most gun violence because it's so common.
It's so common, it no longer really makes headlines.
Until it hits you.
Yes, and then it's very personal.
And honestly, you know, my prediction is, I don't know how long it's going to take, but I think we're on the right side of history. And like most things, labor unions, civil rights, ending of slavery, it took decades. We're in this for the long haul.
So we talk about bringing pressure on politicians and forming movements, and I've heard it said, to echo something you mentioned earlier, that politicians don't form movements, they step in front of movements that are already happening. So how do movements like this gain traction, especially given the amount of advertising and monetary muscle behind the NRA position? Well,
I would suggest if people join organizations such as the Brady Campaign, Illinois Council Against Handgun Violence, Mayors Against Illegal Guns, and by the way, even within the NRA, start agitating that the NRA leadership does not represent me. I remember when the NRA represented conservation, gun safety. That was in the 1960s, not long ago. And people, it's become so radicalized. President George Bush, 41, the oldest Bush, he actually resigned from the NRA, a lifetime membership, when they called the government law enforcement Gestapo. I mean, this is, you know, something so much, he publicly resigned. This is the NRA today. It is not what it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago.
So people, well, it's an interesting question. I don't know if you know whether their membership is rising or declining as a result of this radical path they've taken. Do we know that?
It's increased from what we know, but we also know from surveys that many people in the NRA, many members, support background checks, for example. Some of them do have reservations about magazines that have 50 bullets, that this is not a hunting type of weapon. So there's some diversity of opinion. I know when President Reagan appeared before the NRA, and I think it was Las Vegas a number of years ago, he didn't support, the NRA didn't support gun control, but when he went in the hall, they said, leave your guns out. Secret Service did. And you know, next November, this November, we're going to celebrate, or observe, I guess, the 50th anniversary of President Kennedy getting shot. Now, this is going to be a milestone. If the NRA thinks they got problems in Texas, wait till November. They're going to hook this up to gun violence. And what have we done since then?
So do you think that the message will be received the way it will be received properly? Because the issue behind the Kennedy assassination has always been, well, it was the lone assassin and he was kind of nuts, and you can never stop the lone crazy guy. So you know, that's not to be worried about. Or the more recent NRA position, which is the only way you can stop a bad guy with a gun is to have a good guy with a gun. I mean, so even though this anniversary is coming up, how likely is it that it'll be interpreted in terms of increasing gun control as opposed to being used to talk about self-defense, and we need to arm ourselves because this is the kind of crazy that's out there.
Well, again, when you look at some of the research about self-defense, a very well-known study, Chicago Police, found that 1/3 of the Chicago Police shot in the line of duty were shot with their own guns.
And these are trained law enforcement professionals who know how to handle guns.
And they also have more officers committing suicide with guns. In a typical year, 12 to 15 Chicago police commit suicide with their service weapon. Now, last year, they didn't have any police killed. But typically, in an average year, 5 officers, Chicago police officers, die.
So is this a myth? I mean, the idea that having a gun is going to protect you and it's going to be self-defense, I mean, I'm sure there must be some cases where that happens, but the statistics, do they bear that out?
Well, 250 cases, according to the FBI, of criminals getting killed by law-abiding people with guns occur every year. And you always read about them because they're so infrequent. You don't read about most of the suicides. You don't read about most of the homicides, accidental deaths. This little incident down, I think it was in Kentucky, where the 5-year-old shot a 2-year-old.
Yes,
I mean, and the people down there are saying, well, we don't want to interfere with our local gun culture. This was not the fault of the parents. Where is the accountability for what they did? In the case involving
how do they justify that that's not the fault of the parents? A 5-year-old gets a loaded gun and turns it on a 2-year-old. How can the parents not be responsible?
That's what I'd like to know. You know, the mother in Newtown, you know, has a safe for her mentally disturbed child and has guns there. As pathetic as it was, where's the accountability there? Where's the accountability for the gun industry selling these assault weapons that they know are going to, some of those are going to be misused? Now, I don't want to demonize the gun owners. I don't want to demonize the gun industry. But I think at some point there's got to be a responsibility here.
Well, just as the auto industry took responsibility for auto deaths, you know, and the cars are much safer, the anti-lock brakings, the crumple zones. There's so many things about cars now that are so much safer than they were 40 or 50 years ago. The gun industry doesn't seem to have followed that similar path.
No. Well, there's a more recent example. You recall the Tylenol murders in the northwest suburbs in Chicago.
Yes.
7 people were killed. We never found out who corrupted the Tylenol. We don't know who did it, what their motive was. What was the response of the industry? They took Tylenol off the shelf and they instituted all these safety bans that we all have to deal with whenever we open up anything. And it stopped immediately. When are we going to take guns off the shelf, particularly assault weapons? It's a renegade industry. And, you know, give you an example, there was, in Des Plaines last year, there were 200 guns that were stolen from a gun shop. What happened? They weren't suspended. Their license wasn't suspended. They ended up in Chicago, the south side. Instead, the Des Plaines City Council gave them permission to open a new, bigger gun shop. This is absurd. Where's the accountability here?
Well, on that note, and I think that's a great way to end, because the question is, where's the accountability? And ultimately, it's with you and me and everyone who's watching this show.
Exactly.
So, Mr. Kulis, I want to thank you so much for being on the show. This is an ongoing, evolving story, so I hope you'll come back and talk to us again.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott, and you can find us every Saturday night at 8 o'clock on Comcast Channel 19, and you can find us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night.